Good morning and welcome, and we'll be starting up here in just about a minute or so. Okay, we'll give folks just about a minute to get in there. We just have a few have signed up today. There should definitely be more logged in, so we'll give folks a minute to get themselves logged in. Good morning. It's nice to know the Q&A is working. I'll also watch for that if my sound goes out, because it's being weird this morning. I don't think it likes the heat in my office. Okay, just about enough folks. Okay, I know we're going to have some folks logging in later, I assume, but we're going to go ahead and get started. For those of you who have logged in, it's not fair to wait. So good morning and welcome. Handout, you don't have to type in that handout link or the poll EV link. They're going to magically show up in your chat pod, which you can get by scrolling down to the bottom and hitting chat. The chat is disabled, but you're able to get all the links and they'll show up magically there. Our background person today is Amanda Link. I want to give her thanks for this. And of course, Adam Howell for setting things up. My name is David Orr. I'm the director here at the New York State LTAP Center, the Cornell Local Roads Program. And I want to welcome you today. We're going to be talking about federal aid projects today. Now, obviously in 1 hour, I can't really cover a lot of details, but I do really want to cover some of the basics, some of the important items, and then also give you a bit of a teaser. As a reminder, if you haven't been on one of these webinars before, and again, I don't assume that, the chat has been disabled. Okay, so there's no chat available for you to put your own in, but please open that chat pod up, because when we have links that show up, we'll actually put them in that chat pod. So you can download the handout, which has a bunch of references, and you can download the Poll Everywhere stuff. And if you haven't downloaded it yet, let me go find it. There it is. This is our handout today. It's got all the resources that we're talking about and some we aren't going to talk about today. It's got a whole bunch of acronyms, and we'll talk more about those acronyms in a little bit. You'll notice they're empty for a reason. And then finally, our project development process sheet, which is used by DOT, but it's actually a pretty good tool. Reminds me of the old game of life in a little bit of respects, but we'll go through that in a little bit more detail. So what we are going to be using is we're going to be using the raise hand feature now and then, and the Q&A. Again, I would like your questions as we go, and then the poll EV system to get your feedback during the course of the day, okay, or hour. So the teaser, and I'll come back to this teaser at the end as well. The teaser today is we're developing a longer federal aid workshop. It's going to be this fall. Don't know exactly the date yet, because we're still working on some items. We actually have a meeting a week from now to talk about this with New York State DOT and the Federal Highway Division. The format, how many times, locations, web-based, online. We'll come back to that at the end of the hour today to talk about that a little bit, but we are going to be developing something for those who are interested in federal aid. Today, the webinar is really aimed at making sure you go into the process eyes wide open, that you understand what federal aid is and isn't, and then some of the important characteristics of federal aid. So this might be even truly the federal aid 101, and the workshop is 201 or whatever number universities use these days. So to help me out, I got a
David, we lost you. Well, what I think David was saying was you could go to Poll Everywhere and put what your job, who you work for. There we go.
Can you hear me?
Yep, we can hear you.
Okay, I'm gonna try using my webcam. It's not quite as good in terms of sound. I apologize, and I have no idea why the system has decided to behave this way. But we'll make it work. I'll speak up. If it's the fan's too loud in the background, let me know. I can turn it down, Amanda. Okay. Okay. So local governments, consultants, that should all work. Everybody can see this. I did have somebody put into the Q&A. They work for New York City DOT, which would be a local government. I just trying to get a sense of this. So it's local government and consultants today. Okay, that's good to know. Okay, nobody working for the weekend. Maybe we're getting back to used to being back in the office. I don't know. Okay, the other one is, what is your job title? That's actually maybe just as important. Are you an administrator? You know, someone who administers things? Are you the public works commissioner or the highway superintendent? Are you an engineer primarily? Are you actually a board member? In some respects, this hour really could be useful for board members, and maybe we'll redo it again specifically for them. Or if you're none of the above, you could put that in. And again, if you can't get the full EV, you can put it in the Q&A. And so far, everybody today is an engineer. Interesting. So we have a bunch of engineers today. Okay. Okay, so today it's a bunch of engineers. Interesting. Okay. So, okay. So the handout and the materials, the handout, again, that'll magically show up in the chat pod. If you haven't downloaded it yet, it links you to a bunch of other resources, including the New York State DOT's local projects manual. It has a link to the official code regulations and a manual called the Contract Administration Core Curriculum Manual, which is long and thick and really written for FHWA, but it's still a very useful document. And if you're doing a lot of these kind of projects, you might find that useful to look at a little bit. I would say, truth be told, the place I would go first, other than the local projects manual, would be to go to Federal Aid Essentials. It's a set of videos that were put together by the Federal Highway Administration that outline the process. They're relatively short. They're small snippets. They're covering different aspects. We're not going to show you any of those today. You can go download those and look at those on your own. The introduction video is a minimum I would watch. And then as you start to decide if you want to get into the federal process, for those who haven't, or even if you've done this before, you might pick up something. So it's a good place to go to get some good information and good resources. Okay. Now, part of the reason we're doing this webinar has to do with how many local projects we've got and who's doing those local projects. In the 4-year period from 2016 to 2019, the year before this lovely let's go stay home for a while kind of thing, there were 654 local projects that went to the state through the state DOT local projects bureau outside of New York City. Of that, 247 local agencies. So as you can see, a lot of local agencies had multiple projects, but a lot of agencies had only 1 or 2. Okay. And if you're wondering, by the way, New York City has about 150 projects a year federally. So really, in some respects,
If you've only had one or two, it's a different aspect than if you've done a whole bunch of them. So helping me out, how many federal aid projects have you completed? Okay. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 to 9, or 10 plus, and I probably should have put 0 in here now that I think about it. But if you've done the 0, you can just leave it off, and maybe put that in Q&A for me. If you've done 0, put it in Q&A. I'm actually going to make a note to myself to change that for the future. Okay. Okay, so we get quite a blend. We have a bunch of folks who've done 1 or 2, and we've got a bunch of folks who've done 5 to 9 or even 10 or more. Okay, so quite a variety. That helps me as we're going through our hours today. So as an example, can you put in the kind of projects you've done with federal aid for those of you who have done them? So, you know, was it a bridge? Was it a safety improvement? If you've done none, you can put in none. That's fine. That's useful for us to see. But what kind of projects have you done with federal aid? Again, that's useful to, as we discuss this later on. So some people's offices have done them. How many have personally completed, or your department? I guess I would say there, Jim, ones you're familiar with, so that if someone was to say, do you understand the federal aid process? It would be that kind of project. It's one that you understand. Okay. So if it was a bridge project and you work in safety, don't put that down. Okay. So we have bridges and roads. We have a none. Okay. We have some environmental folks, operational support for folks who are doing them. Okay. Trails, and trails is one. In fact, the picture that I showed at the beginning is actually a trail in Windham, New York, that was done with a combination of state and federal aid. It's still federal aid. There's still a process involved. So a little different if it's federal highway, but there's still federal aid involved. So we're focused on federal highway, but just keep that in mind, federal aid issues for lots of different things. Okay. Housing assistance, yeah. Again, that would be totally different sets of funding, but some of the thoughts and processes aren't really that different. Okay. So what we're going to do today, and we did this before when we did this webinar in a slightly different version back in February, we're going to look at 2 projects, the 2 most common projects from that list of over 500 that we got from the state. We're going to look at a bridge project, and we're going to look at a safety project. We're going to use these during our hour as sort of thinking about it. So, you know, imagine either a bridge replacement or major rehab, or maybe a safety improvement, you know, trying to improve how the kids can walk to school, or putting a roundabout in on a federal aid or national highway system roadway. So think about a project in your community that you'd like to work on that might be eligible for federal aid. We'll talk a little bit about how folks can get objects on the federal aid process here in just a minute. Now, again, I told you it's in the handout. There's a chart that New York State DOT put out. They call it their project development process, and it reminded me when I first saw it of the game of life. It's a pretty cool little chart. It's real busy. So I know what you're thinking right now. You're going, hey, the font's too small. I can't read it. Yeah, I know. That's okay. Don't try to read it. The figure is on the web and it's in your handout. So don't try to read it. We'll go through some of the details in an hour. We can't cover a lot, but it really sort of breaks, because of the color, into 5 steps: planning, scoping, design, construction, operations, and maintenance. Okay. And so really, if you think about, like any project, there's a planning phase, there's a scoping phase, there's the phase where you design things, you actually build them, and then operations and maintenance. And we start the process back over again. Okay. So it's a good way to think about all projects, and we're going to do that here in just a minute. The federal aid folks, FHWA, have a flow chart which looks very similar, but it has some different focus areas. So for instance, they focus a lot on right-of-way and clearance of any environmental issues, preliminary plans. You'll notice, in fact, if you look carefully, it's focused a lot on making sure the processes are followed, that we're spending the funds in the proper way. And then they end with audits. Once the audits are done, the project is closed out, the FHWA steps away, But really, it becomes the responsibility of the agency doing the work, whether it's a local agency or the state DOT, to operations and maintenance. And again, until we start that cycle over. So it's the same process. It's just different sets of works. So we're going to use the one from the state DOT just because I think it's clear and understandable. And of course, you're going to be maintaining it when you're done. Okay. Now, I want to hit two things. These are important points I want you to take home. If you take home nothing else, remember this. And it's the old joke. Which came first, the chicken or the egg? Or maybe it's the joke about why the chicken crossed the road. But when it comes to federal aid, realize federal aid is a reimbursement program. You got to spend it first and then get reimbursed. Okay, so think about that from a cash flow standpoint. You got to spend it first and you'll get reimbursed. And you can't spend it until you have authorization. So if you're doing preliminary activities before you get even the funding, you may need to cover those with your own funds. Just be aware of that. Now, there are ways to get some reimbursements for almost every part of the process, but you have to have the authorization first. In this case, what comes first is the authorization, not the chicken. Okay. So let's go through those 5 major steps: planning, scoping, design, construction, operation, and maintenance. Okay, and again, we can look at our chart. Okay. Now, there are more details on the handout, and I would advise you to look that over before you get into the federal aid process. While it's the DOT process, they use it too. They get federal aid, of course, as well. So let's talk a little bit about planning. Okay. Now, planning really is something we do in our brain. We do it on paper, but it really, in some respects, is starting the process and building it on paper in our brain before we actually go out and do the project, whether it's a bridge or it's a safety project. So again, we're going to go back to Pull Everywhere. How long does it take you at your agency to take a project from initial inception, I want to do this, to construction? And let's look at a bridge, either rehab or major replacement, or look at a road, a big improvement, not just a chip seal. How long does it take you from project inception to construction? What's your cycle? Okay, so about half of you say 1 to 2 years, quarter of you say less than a year, and a quarter of you say 3 to 4 years. When you're in the federal aid process, with exceptions of some grants, and we'll talk about a couple of grants here in a minute, you need more time than that. You're going to have more time because of the process. And we'll talk about that process a little bit during this hour. So keep that in mind. Your cycle time is going to take a little longer because there's going to be more steps involved. So it's important to be aware of that fact. So yeah, you may want to think about a little bit longer cycle time. So that means you need to be looking further down the road for projects you might want to get onto federal aid. Okay. And more than 5 years. I know I see at least one name there from the state. I guarantee you a lot of state projects take longer than 5 years. Certainly the K Bridge down in New York City took more than 5 years from project conception until it was completed. Okay. So in terms of funding for federal aid projects, there's lots of different ones out there. The biggest thing to remember is you need to get the project on the State Transportation Improvement Program. Our first acronym of today, the STIP. Okay. You'll sometimes just hear TIP, which is the Transportation Improvement Program. They're similar. There are some differences, but the main thing I want you to remember is there is a process to get on that STIP, to get a project. For bridges and things that are federal aid highways, National Highway System highways, that's a very important process because there's lots of funding for that. Okay. There are grants, however, that can not bypass the step because they do get added to it, but short circuit the timing. So when the grant comes out, you can go on and you can actually get a grant that will speed up the process somewhat. Actually, I realized I do actually have a link that you might want to look at. I'm going to throw it in the chat. I forgot to give it to Amanda, so it's my fault, not Amanda's. There are 2 state grant processes which you may really want to look into, and there's a link in the chat pod available. One is the TAP, okay, which is the Transportation Alternatives Program. That's where Safe Routes to School went. That's where you can do some aesthetic things. That's where you can do improvements that are related to safety. It's a good program because all roads are eligible. There's no, oh, it's not a national highway road, I can't get funds. All roads are eligible, but obviously bigger pool of competition too. So keep that in mind. But TAP-CMAC is a single program. That's the way it's listed on the state's website. But right now there is some TAP grants that are out there or about to be out there. So you may want to read that and go online if you're interested. CMAC, by the way, is congestion mitigation and air quality improvement. You can imagine probably focused more on urban areas. But again, we're looking at environmental air quality issues. And of course, many of you have probably done Bridge New York projects. Bridge New York is a federal program. It actually meets the federal standards versus Culvert New York, which is state funds and meets a slightly different set of standards, but the process is the same. There are others, and in our hour, we're not going to be able to get into a lot of them. CHIPS is a state project. CHIPS funds are state dollars, but you still want the same process. So while we're talking about federal aid, it's still a good thing to use the same process for all of our work. So let's talk about that. So we got to figure out, we got to plan, we got to figure out what we want to do, and we got to get some funding. Once you've got the funding, you got to figure out how you're going to spend it. And yes, it's a bit of a chicken and egg, but remember, you got to get the funding and it's reimbursement. Okay. So let's talk a little bit about scoping. Okay. When my computer says wake up, there we go. Now we can do a scoping exercise. Okay. We can do a bridge. We could do a safety improvement. But let's just, let's see today. I think what we'll do today, the last time we did a bridge. So let's do a safety improvements. Okay. So let's do a safety improvement exercise. Okay. Actually, for some reason, let's see something here. Huh, it's not showing safety improvement. So let's just write on here safety improvement. Okay, and what we'll do is how about, oh, let's do one of those weird days. I don't think it likes to heat my office. It's just one of those days. Okay, let's do it the old-fashioned way then. Let's do a well, we're just going to have one of those days. I'm just going to have to say something. Technology. Let's do a roundabout. Let's imagine you're putting in a roundabout. Okay. What do you have to think about in the scope if you're putting a roundabout in? So in the Q&A or in the polev.com, give me some examples of things you need to think about if you're going to put a roundabout in. You'd need to think about real estate and right-of-way. Yeah. Yep. You need to think about your work limits. You're probably going to go outside the existing road. Okay. What are the intersecting angles? Okay. What's the quantity of the sites? What's the number of vehicles? Yeah. The intersection. Okay. The limits. The size of the circle. Is it a mini roundabout? Is it a larger roundabout? Is it low speed, high speed? What are the traffic volumes? Are all of the legs owned by the same agency? Yeah. Okay. Just imagine, start going through that process. And truth be told, you probably want to get yourself a big whiteboard and just start writing, just figuring it all out, because the reality is there's probably a lot more to it than you realize. Okay. And we're going to do a different exercise in just a minute for that. But just think about any project you're doing. You really want to do that project ahead of time, if at all possible. Okay. So keep that in mind when you're doing a scoping exercise. Yeah, somebody put environmental. Yeah, that's pretty important. For anything, you got to think about environmental. Okay. When it comes to scoping is really a pretty important process. It takes quite a bit of time. This is where you've brought a consultant on board and you're developing all the details, but then you go to design. You don't want to go to design until you've got all the scoping done. And one thing you want to be real careful of is scope creep. Okay, you don't really want that to go too far. Now, when it comes to design, there's things you need to think about that be pretty important when it comes to design. And I'm going to go back through some of the details here in a little bit. But there's two I want to point out during the design phase, because a lot of people think this is a construction phase issue and it's too late. You really need to finish up anything in these couple of areas long before you get to the actual construction. So this is actually during the design. The first one is one that we've already mentioned in our poll there just a second ago, and that's the environmental issues. Okay, so NEPA. Okay, so NEPA, if you don't know, stands for the National Environmental Policy Act, another acronym, NEPA. Essentially, it means environmental. You got to worry about endangered species. You might have to worry about issues of wetlands. This is where you really got to focus in, and this is one of those where you really want to get approval, not permission afterwards. So you really need it ahead of time. Okay. By the way, this is just a plain old new, nothing fancy about him, but it just reminds us what we're really trying to do is protect the environment so that it's here for a long time for everybody. So you got to do that during the design phase. Okay. And then the other one is the right of way. Okay. You have to, with federal dollars, you have to have the right of way before you do the construction. You have to own the right of way. Okay. So most local roads that are in villages and towns aren't owned by the agency. They're actually roads by use or streets by prescription. Okay. Essentially, what you've got to do during the design phase is you have to have a deed. Okay, you have to have a piece of paper that says we have the right to this right of way. Now, it can just be an easement, but it has to be a piece of paper that gives you the right to do what you need to do, and preferably owned. In some cases, it has to be, depending on the project. Because a lot of our roads in New York State become roads because they were used by the public for 10 or more years. And in the case of towns, the town has done maintenance. In the case of a village, no one has stopped the public from using it. Okay. And we could spend a whole hour just on that issue. But keep that in mind, you have to have the right of way ahead of time. You don't want an issue like that. It's still true here. There's a small piece of property. It's in New York City. The Hess estate owned. And no one actually officially ever took the land properly when they put in a new road. And so there's this little triangle of land that's not in the public right of way. People walk over it all the time. It's in front of a little store down in the Greenwich Village area. You got to have the right of way ahead of time, or it can lead to some serious complications. Okay. Now, this is also the phase where you're doing public meetings, though I can tell you right now, there are public meetings in every single phase. The best public meetings in my mind are the ones where you're getting feedback from the public and you're using them to help you make improvements into the design. But there are some you have to meet federal aid requirements. But if you can have meetings where you get information back from people, that's really useful. So you should do some in the planning phase. You should do some in the scoping phase. And of course, you have to do some of the design phase as well. Where do you have the meetings? Well, these days, it's a bit challenging with COVID. You can do some virtual stuff even now. But the key is try to go to the people if you can. So a fire hall that's near the bridge site, a VFW that's across the street. Try to have the public meetings in a setting where you can get good feedback from the public rather than just becoming here's a bunch of information. Okay. So this is something just to keep in mind. There may be formal requirements in some steps, and these are outlined in the local projects manual. Then we get to construction. Okay, now it's quite interesting. The big chart, construction is one little part of it, and yet this is where we spend 90% of our money is during the construction phase. But we definitely want to make sure we've got our details worked out on construction, because obviously you have a problem. This is where they're going to hit us. This is where you do your contract letting and award, you do the actual building, and then you do a closeout. Okay. So what are some typical problems you've seen, and not just federal aid projects, any project you've done? Give me some examples of the kind of problems that you had during construction that, oh man, I wish I had taken care of that ahead of time. Okay. And it could be during construction or it could be afterwards. But what are some typical kind of construction problems that you're like, oh man, yeah, did you get your permits? That probably should have been done in the design phase. Okay. Did you get enough geotechnical investigation? That may even go all the way back to scoping, because if it turns out there's a poor geotech, you might have wanted to do that earlier. Unanticipated issues, maybe utilities underneath, a slope that you weren't aware of. Okay. Issues with the contractor. Okay. Slopes that weren't put in properly, maybe the bridge slope or the slope on the corner of the roadway wasn't done right. Okay. Think about all the kind of construction problems that you might have. It could be a survey issue. And again, most of the time, if you really think about it, a lot of these issues should have or could have been resolved during the design phase. Okay. So keep that in mind. Is it really a construction problem, or is it something we should have taken care of with a better spec or during the earlier phases? Okay. Now there are a couple that I want to make sure we don't forget about. Yeah, weather is an issue, and weather is one that we do have a hard time dealing with, especially if it changes in the weather. But a couple I want to make sure we don't forget about: the Americans with Disabilities Act, ADA, during and after construction are very critical issues. And remember, it's not just people in wheelchairs. It's people who have a hard time walking, they have sight issues, hearing issues, things like that. Do you have good QA/QC? Quality assurance and control can be a big issue. Certification of your materials. The key, a lot of this, do you have good inspectors who are able to work with the agency? And yes, you could have a disaster that comes along. You know, there's nothing that says you couldn't have a flood during a bridge thing, or a big thunderstorm that comes along, or even a crash that occurs during a safety improvement that you got to deal with. Those are the unexpected, unanticipated. But look at the ones that you can anticipate and try to reduce those where you can. And then finally, it comes back to operations and maintenance. Okay. What's the lifespan? How long is it going to last? And then, of course, it goes back to planning. So now we talked about construction and a little bit afterwards, but what's the biggest issue you've had with a brand new project? When you were done, you were like, wish we had done it differently when we built it, designed it, or scoped it. Give me an example of some examples of issues you've had with a brand new project. I think I got my pen working. Yeah. Any issues with a new project? Should you have used pavers versus concrete? Yeah, that's a good example. It costs more money than you thought. Maybe the maintenance costs more money than you thought. You know, you build something cheap and now you're spending more on maintenance. Okay, yeah, good examples. Okay. This just reminds me of something that I think we all should get in the habit of doing. It's a little harder to do with federal aid, but it's something we still should do. And that is, once you think you're done, give it some time, a couple of weeks, a couple of months, depending on the project, go back and check it out. You may find, oh, that stop sign really should be in a different spot. The pattern on the traffic light, the timing should have been different. Maybe we need to do a better job on our joint, or we've got a movement of the ADA ramp. Plan on going back. Yes, it's probably outside federal aid. There are some exceptions if it hasn't been closed out yet. That's why you may want to wait on the closeout. But you really want to make sure you check to make sure it's doing what you thought it was doing when you built it. Okay. It goes back to this idea of the whole process. Okay. What we're going to do now is an exercise. We did this before. We're going to do it again because it's just a good one. I got another one I may try when we do the Federal Aid 101, because it's just a real good example We're going to plan, scope, design, construct, and then think about long-term for an ice cream sundae. University is actually doing something down campus today where supposedly they're going to have ice cream. I volunteered, but I don't know the details of it yet. So we'll see how that works. But what do you need in an ice cream sundae? Okay. And let me clear the responses from our one here. Let me clear this. There we go. So now we're going to be doing an ice cream sundae. So what do I need to know in terms of design, construction? Who's the customer? Well, it's you're the customer in this case. You're making it for yourself. Okay. So you need the ingredients for your ice cream sundae. What kind of ingredients do you need? You need ice cream. Yeah. Okay. That's one. Yep. Got to have some ice cream for an ice cream sundae. Good. Good to see. What else you need? You need a dish to put it in. Yeah. Yeah. That's pretty important. You need a utensil to eat it and maybe a utensil to serve it. Yeah. That's pretty good. Okay. You need some flavors and toppings. Do you like sprinkles? Do you like whipped cream? Okay. You want a big dish, a little dish? Okay. Is there anything else we're missing? The project all the way from the beginning to the end. Was the dish clean? Did you clean it afterwards so it's ready for the next ice cream sundae? How many people are involved? That's a good one. Somebody put in there. Yeah. So how much ice cream do you need? Do you have anybody who has allergies? So you got to avoid certain things. What about someone who's lactose intolerant? Do you have an alternative for them? Okay. Do you have napkins? Because hopefully with an ice cream sundae, you need napkins. That sounds like a simple thing, just making an ice cream sundae. But when you start thinking about it, you really need to think the whole process through. And that's true with federal aid and true with non-federal aid projects. And of course, the most important thing you can do is communicate. When we talked to the FHWA and DOT, when we did a session on this earlier, the biggest thing was communication. If you don't communicate, you're going to have problems. So the biggest issue by far is communication. If you're not sure, pick up the phone, pop an email, ask. Okay. Now, when we did this before, we focused on chapter 15 on purpose. We were asked to, but it's a reminder of the kind of things you need to look at. The local projects manual is something you really want to look at carefully. And there's a bunch of chapters. So don't assume, read through them. And how can you learn this? Well, I got good news for you. Those acronyms that I gave you, the danger of the acronym minefield, that acronym minefield is a good way to learn. When you know the acronyms, you're probably pretty close to being able to understand the process. Okay, so rather than using the jargon, say it out. Do it completely. Okay, so we'll give you a couple towards the end, and I'm going to give you some as we go along, but think about the acronyms and the definitions. And when you're talking to folks who aren't in your community, make sure you don't use the acronyms too much or you define them. Because if you tell somebody, for instance, NYSLTAP, I know what NYSLTAP is. Y'all all know what NYSLTAP is, but outside of that, do people really know what New York State Department of Transportation is? So be careful about doing too much. Quickly, I want to talk about roles and responsibilities. In 1 hour, we can't do a lot, but I just want to make sure you understand there is a role for everybody. There's a federal role, there's a state role, in this case, New York State DOT or NYSLTAP, and there's a sponsor role. Now, for local agencies, the sponsor is the local agency, but it could be a non-government organization in some cases, or it could even be the state themselves as the sponsor, okay? But we're going to talk about this as if it was a local government, okay? So FHWA, which is part of the U.S. Department of Transportation, has the responsibility to, and this is a quote, so I'm going to actually show it on screen. I don't like to show this much text, but there's a reason for it. To ensure recipients of federal aid deliver the program, which includes project delivery, in an efficient, effective, and compliant manner with federal requirements. So they're really focused on efficient, effective, and compliant, okay? So that's their role and responsibilities. And we'll talk a lot more about that when we get into the longer federal aid 101. New York State DOT's responsibility is they're actually the ones who take the federal dollars and they actually parse them out. And so they put up responsibilities in terms of the rules, the requirements for agencies who are doing the work. In the case of locals, that means the local project manual. They answer questions on federal regulations, and they provide technical assistance out of main office to the regional offices. Now, when they have a question, they go back to Federal Highway, and they have folks at Federal Highway called area engineers who help them out. But the single most important person if you're with a local project to get to know and to be able to have meetings with them of some type is the RLPL. Now in the Q&A, does anybody know what RLPL stands for? Another acronym, you'll hear it a lot. You get in the federal aid. What's an RLPL? Regional Project Manager, close. It's technically the Regional Local Project Liaison. This is the contact point between the state DOT and the local agency of the sponsor, okay? You really want to know who that person is. You might even, before you go get federal aid, get their name and pop them a note. Get to know them. They can be very, very helpful and help you solve problems. And if you talk to them early, they can really help you solve problems. So get to know your RLPL as soon as you can and create a relationship. Definitely worth it. And then finally, when you see the term sponsor, and it shows up in all the documentation, really means local agency if you're a local agency. As again, they write this because it could be a non-local agency. Okay? So the local agency has responsibilities. They have to have a responsible local official. This is the person who's signing off on the project. Okay? That usually is an elected person in a lot of cases. There are some ways it can be an appointed person, but essentially it's an official, someone who's taken an oath of office. There has to be a project manager. The project manager has to be a full-time employee of the sponsor. Okay? There's an engineer in charge or a resident engineer, somebody who's on site watching the work. They're not full-time necessarily. They could be a consultant even, but they're in charge of certain requirements of paperwork. They monitor everything. Okay, they could be staff, they could be a consultant, but they report to the project manager, who is a full-time employee. And then there are inspectors, and there are requirements for how many inspectors depending on the size of the project. But again, to make sure you understand is if you get federal aid, you have to have a full-time employee who is the project manager. Now, they may not be full-time on that one project, don't get me wrong. They could be doing a lot of different projects. But for those of you who've done federal aid projects, how many projects do you think you could do as a project manager at the same time? So in the Q&A, how many different projects do you think you could do at the same time? Four or five, someone put in 3, 6, 3, probably depends on the size of the project, depends on how many engineers you have helping you out. Do you have a consultant? And how familiar are you with the process? Okay, probably not more than a few, unless you've done a lot of them or you have a big staff working for you. So look at your agency and decide, but you do have to have an employee who's full-time, okay? Now you may have a project manager, an engineer in charge, or somebody who's not full-time, but somebody has to be full-time overseeing things. And in terms of roles and responsibilities, things to think about, you're going to have to go to a pre-construction meeting. So during design scoping, you're involved. You're going to have to make sure you've got good inspection staff, ensure compliance with all the steps, deal with change orders. We'll come back to that right before the end of the hour here, and then complete the closeout of the process. Okay. Now, one of the projects that comes into play, and this is a very important one, this is what we focused on in the spring, and I'll bring it back up because it is so important, is when you're doing federal aid, before you actually build things, you develop a construction management plan, okay? Think of it like a recipe for your ice cream sundae. Before you turn the soil, You take all those design documents and you write a plan. In fact, you can actually make it part of the plan of the design phase. And in that, you meet with that RLPL, the regional project lead, local project liaison, and you have project milestones. Got the glass out, got the ice cream, got the syrup, everything's ready to go. Let's start putting it together. You have good quality assurance and quality control. Is the milk still good? If I'm using a milkshake, is the cherry, the right type? QA, QC. And you can use something called the MERC. And there's a reference to this. You don't need to write that down. It's in your handout. But the MERC is one of the most important things to understand. It's the Manual of Uniform Record Keeping, another acronym. But the MERC is a way to monitor everything. Okay. Now, QA, QC does not stand for quit asking, quit checking. QA, QC is quality control, quality assurance. Another way to think about it that actually can help you as a mnemonic remembering things is QC is the quality of the contractor, QA is the quality by the agency. But the idea is making sure you've got processes in place. Does the steel meet spec? The concrete strong enough? Is the breakaway hardware the right type? And so you've got a quality assurance program. Again, part of your overall plan, and you provide certification and documentation. And if you don't have that, you may not get your money back. So keep that in mind. So just because of the interest of time, because I shut down, not you, we're not going to go through QA, but think about that a little bit. We'll come back to that when we do the longer session. I do want to spend a minute or so here on change orders. Okay. By the way, you'll see in the state local projects manual, a lot of the documentation, they use the term order on contract. Order on contract, change order, same thing. But whether you're asking for a time extension or a change order where you are asking for money, some things are legitimate, some are not. So give me some example of legitimate change order items. Things that, if you submitted that, you'd be like, yeah, that's worth paying, versus things you probably should have thought about ahead of time, or that really aren't legitimate. Give me some legitimate change order items in the Q&A poll here. Over excavation needed because of a stable foundation. So you started digging it out and you realized, ooh, I got to dig out extra because it's not going to be stable otherwise. And that may be legitimate, but also think about, could you have caught that with a more detailed geotech investigation? The answer might be no, but I just want you to think about, whenever you're thinking about whether something's legitimate, think about, could you have responsibly taken it out? Unprecedented weather, yeah, that would be one. The concept is the unforeseen underlying issues, exactly what the person put in there, okay? Unforeseen. So differing site conditions, a lot of times we want to say, oh, that's an unforeseen, but would a reasonable person have said, or an engineer really, said, we should have thought that. Was the concrete, too low and settled? Is that a problem that we should have seen? Okay. You can't go and say, well, we need more concrete because we didn't properly account for it. So think about what's legitimate. Is it truly unforeseen underlying issues? Okay. And then finally, of course, you close the project out. You've got a lot of paperwork to deal with. The project is not done just because you think the last stage has been turned. You really got to do a final inspection. You make a punch list from that final inspection. The sponsor's there. In a lot of cases, the RLPL has to be there, but somebody else has to monitor it. And then you close the contract out. The thing you got to realize is just because you've done these steps, you're not quite done yet. You got to do final acceptance. And final acceptance is a federal aid issue, so it's federal highway. And it's important because it ensures that there is no outstanding claims, that the contractors and subcontractors have been paid. There's no unfinished work. And there's no pending issues, okay? So a good example of this is give yourself a little time to see if it's working. because if you need to make a minor change, you can still do that, but not after the project's been completely closed out. And that would be all after the final inspection. And yes, you may wind up with 2 final inspections in that particular case. That can happen. Now, just because it's been accepted, it's now into your operations maintenance, you got to keep records. General rule of thumb is 3 years after the last action for any paperwork. Okay. 10 years, by the way, if it's on the national highway system. And because of some changes in the law, you may actually need 36 years in the case of some DOT funds because of tax issues. So truth be told, get yourself good records retention and realize if it's part of the structure, if it's part of the road, if it's an engineering activity, you need it till 3 years after the structure or the road is gone. How likely is the road to no longer be there? So pretty much you may want to think about engineering records, as-built, things like that. They're pretty much permanent. You got to keep them pretty much forever. And that's not just for federal aid, that's for any project. You really want to think about that. I have been asked questions from when I worked in Yates County. This quarter of a century ago. I still got the plan for anything I designed. And you should actually be doing that under state education law anyway. Now there may be audits. People hate the term audits, but they can be performed by anybody, state, FHWA, other federal agencies. Hey, you might want to do them yourself. The key with an audit really is to realize they're just checking to make sure we follow efficient, effective, and compliance. That federal aid issue that I mentioned earlier. Okay. Now there are some other issues. We could spend a whole hour just on this. Okay. There's issues such as Buy America, Buy American. And yes, there's differences. We could talk about civil rights. We could talk about DBE goals, commitments, and attainments. Okay. Oh, and by the way, one real important point with DBE, there's a state program, MBE, WBE, and the DBE, which is a federal program. They don't overlap. You can't put one goal or the other. You have to just use one or the other. Federal aid, DBE, state aid, MBE, WBE. Is it a commercially useful function? You know, if you're trying to have somebody do work, is what they're doing useful function? Does it actually improve the project, improve the process? Do people get paid quick enough? Okay. There's some requirements on how quickly people get paid. Okay. And again, in 1 hour, we don't have time to go a lot of details, but these are the kind of things we'll talk about the Federal Aid 101 we're developing with the state because they've already got a program. We're just going to work on tweaking it a little bit. And then I'm bringing it back up because it is so critical, ADA. Keep that in mind. And it's not just people in wheelchairs. It's really all of us, if you think about it. Just because you're having a bad day and you got a broken leg, you're still following some of the same issues with the ADA. And during that time, you want to think about how could you walk through that site. Prevailing wage issues come into play, Davis-Bacon, all that fun stuff. Okay, again, and this is just a partial list. These are all outlined in the local projects manual. What it really comes back to is at the end of this, the one thing we never want to see is something called, acronym time, a FAIN. Anybody know what a FAIN stands for? You heard the term FAIN? F-A-I-N. I hope you don't get to the point where you know this acronym. I now know it. I don't like it, but you should get to know this particular one, only from the standpoint that you don't want to ever see it. It's called a federal aid ineligibility notice. What essentially it says is you aren't going to get some of your funds because you did something that either broke a federal rule or you didn't get permission ahead of time. Okay. So as an example, do you see a possible FAIN problem here? In other words, is there something on this that if somebody came by from DOT, either federal or state, and they saw this, they might go, you're not following a particular standard. There's something wrong here. In Q&A, anybody want to tell me what they see? There's no safety precautions. There's no caps on the rebar. The person isn't wearing a hard hat. They're not wearing a vest. And yes, you have to wear a vest even if it's a closed road with federal aid. Okay. Just so you know, there's OSHA issues, and yes, those OSHA can come in just as well. Okay. So realize there could be environmental issues and all kinds of stuff. And again, because of the hour, because my system shut down, we won't do the FAIN examples. I'll just leave the old ones up here. Okay, some people have already put some in possibly, but the idea is there's examples that can exist out there. Okay. What I do want to do is spend a couple of minutes with a couple of examples of acronyms. Okay, there's a handout. Again, you're not going to know them all. I just want to do a couple of quick acronyms to get you a sense to start thinking about it. Okay, so I'm going to start with the first one that you've already seen. Oh, let's get a pen color that everybody can actually read. Got my pen working, but I didn't change the color. There we go. So let's do FAIN. That one should be easy since I just gave it to you. What's FAIN? In the Q&A, tell me what FAIN is. Federal aid ineligibility orders. Yeah, you don't want to see that. Now, they won't take all your funds. By the way, there's this, no, they're going to take all my funds. No, they're going to take a portion. You know, if you had to spend an extra $60,000 on an inspection because you didn't get inspection ahead of time, yeah, you might lose that. But if it's just a case of a slab that wasn't inspected, they may not pay for that slab, but they're still going to pay for the rest of the system. Okay. Let's do another one that's pretty important. RLPO. What's an RLPO? Regional Local Projects Liaison, the person you really need to get to know. Yeah, that's good. Good. Okay, let's do another one here. This isn't an acronym, but it's a definition. Who is the sponsor? So local agency for locals, yeah. Could be the state for a state project, but yeah, important ones to think about. Okay, I'm going to do two more. Probably the project owner. Not always, by the way, but it's the lead agency. Okay. Okay, I'm going to do two more. One that I have not talked about, but it's pretty important. I mentioned it, but I didn't describe it real carefully. It's another definition. What do I mean when I say the division? You hear the term division when it comes to an organization. What is the division? Which agency though? Again, these are the kind of things where you start to get these terminologies, and once you know them, you're probably pretty good. This is actually the Federal Highway Administration, or FHWA, state office. So each state has a division office within each state. And so a lot of the division operations, in our case, Albany, managing with the state federal aid. Okay, so here's the term division. And then one last one, and then we'll go to our last question for the day. Get you out of here right on time. PMP. You may see the term PMP. It goes along with that construction plan. What do you think a PMP is? And this goes project management plan. Somebody's pretty good. Of course, anybody who went to Cornell, we think that more poor man's pizza. But yes, the project management plan. Very good. Nice job. Okay. So again, get to know these acronyms and definitions. And the list doesn't have all of them, but it's a good place to start. What I do want is your help. Okay. As I mentioned at the very beginning, we're developing an updated version of the Federal Aid 101 workshop. You can actually see the current slide deck from NYSLTAP, but what we're really looking at is how can we make this as useful as possible across the entire state for as many folks as possible. Okay. So I'm going to first put up a poll everywhere question, and I want to know what format you like. Okay. And I think I just realized, let me just see, I thought I changed it, but I'm not sure. gonna just check here and see, I can only give you one. Actually, let me just see here. Can I? No, I can only give you one. You get to choose your top one. I think I tried to set it up where you can do multiple ones, but we'll go from there. Okay. So do you want it to be in person? Would you like to do a series of webinars? It could be 4 or 5 hours worth of webinars, either over the course of a couple of days or one day. Do you want to try to do some online, some hybrid approach? Would that be preferred? Or is there some other thing you're thinking of that could be helpful? So again, this is your chance. So right now, oh, it's a ranking one. That's right. I did ranking. So you can choose and rank them, which you like best. Okay, so you want webinar, hybrid, which would be a mixture of these, online, in person, or other. Okay. So what's one do you like? So webinars, very popular, Jacob. Okay. Hybrid is second, some online setup where you just do everything online. In person is fourth. Interesting. And we have the counts. I'll get the counts and we'll look at those. But again, we're looking at setting this up for your use. And then last thing I'd like to know is who's the audience? I didn't do a poll for that, but again, if you just think about it, who's the audience? Is it the engineers? Is it the elected officials? Who would be the audience? And you can either throw that in the Q&A or you can email us afterwards. I don't care who the audience might be. I'm going to go ahead and move on to our last slide, which allows you to also email any question you've got. You can email it directly to me at david.org, Cornell, or CLRP at Cornell, or you can go on our website and click there and there's a link to our email addresses. But just, who should be involved? Engineers, local governments, and maybe we have different sessions for different people. And with that, it's 10:01. I stole a minute from you. For those who want the PDHs, we'll be sending those out if you stayed for most of this, and we don't penalize you for me disappearing for a couple of minutes. And again, if you would put into the Q&A, I'll leave it open. Amanda, leave it open for about a minute or two and let people put in who they think would be a good attendees. And then we'll shut down here in about 2 minutes. Okay. And if you have any questions, you can put them in the Q&A as well. I'll answer them right now. Okay. Yeah, different presentations for elected officials. Yeah, I can't disagree with you there. Consulting engineers should attend. Yeah. Okay. Okay. Well, I think that's pretty good. Thank you again for indulging us with the day. Hope you enjoyed the hour and got something out of it. Look for announcements as we develop these materials. As I said early in the webinar, we're doing a meeting next week to finalize some of these details and set some timing. And we'll go from there. Everybody have yourself a great day. Thanks again. Thanks, Amanda, for the background stuff. And everybody stay safe. Stay well.